nonprofit Just Vision has been documenting Israel-Palestine for over 20 years. I speak with its leaders, Julia Bacha and Suhad Babaa. I'm Tom Powers, and this is Pure Nonfiction. Just Vision is a unique organization with staff based in Israel, Palestine, and the United States. Creative director Julia Bacha is originally from Brazil. She started her film career in Cairo, working on the acclaimed documentary Control Room about how the media covered the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Her first project with Just Vision was Encounterpoint, that profiles Israelis and Palestinians who've dedicated themselves to peace. Her next film was Budrus, focused on Palestinians leading a campaign of nonviolent resistance and making alliances with Israeli activists to save a village from destruction. Both films played to audiences all over the world and won numerous awards. When it came time to bring Budrus to audiences, Just Vision brought on Suhad Babaa to lead the Impact campaign. She rose to become the organization's executive director. Over the years, Just Vision has produced several films and expanded into other forms of journalism, including the Hebrew language news site Local Call. Their most recent film is called Boycott. Set in the United States, it looks at the rising controversy over people who support boycotts aimed at pressuring Israel on its human rights record. The tactic of boycotts has an esteemed history in protest movements from civil rights to anti-apartheid. But in recent years, state legislators have been passing laws meant to silence boycotts. The film follows three individuals who go to court in Arkansas, Texas, and Arizona to protect their freedom of expression. Over the past 6 months, as violence has escalated in Israel, Gaza, and the West Bank, Just Vision has been supporting journalists on the ground. Currently, you can watch all their films for free at justvision.org. Earlier this week, I connected to Julia in New York and Suhad in Washington, D.C. to discuss Boycott and their current work. I started by asking Julia how she got started with the group.
I joined the Just Vision team in 2004. This was a year after Ronit Avni had founded the organization with the goal of telling the stories related to Israel and Palestine that we were not seeing covered on mainstream media. And at that time, I thought that I was going to help Ronit and Jolene and Nahani, who were the other 3 team members at Just Vision, make one documentary film, and that I would then move on and continue probably working for a while in Middle Eastern issues, which was my topic. I had, prior to Encounterpoint, worked with Jihan Nujaim as the writer and editor of Control Room, which was my opening to the power of documentary film. And I loved the idea that Ronit had with the organization, which was how to use the documentary films in an intentional way to change the conversation around what was then and sadly continues to be a very toxic conversation often.
Your work at Just Vision has always been done in alliance with both Israelis and Palestinians, and I wonder what you've learned about forging those alliances.
So it was very intentional from the beginning that we wanted to target 3 core audiences that we felt were the most important as far as changing the dynamics for the people on the ground. And those sort of 3 main audiences were Israeli audiences, Palestinian audiences, and American audiences here in the United States, as a country that has huge influence on what's happens on the ground. And so the team from the very beginning was built with that in mind. And our production teams have always had Israelis and Palestinians as part of the team. We also have outreach staff in all of these 3 communities that are deeply embedded and connected to the future of what happens in that region, that are obviously we're going to bear the consequences of the impact that a film on that topic has on those communities. And for us, that was really critical because we didn't want to make a film without being very clear on what the consequences of that film were about the communities whose stories we were telling.
So you described when you first worked on Encounterpoint, you imagined that might be, one step, and then you'd go on to make other films. Um, Instead, you followed up that film with Budrus, about a Palestinian village that is trying to use nonviolent means to bring attention to its destruction. What was your thinking from Encounterpoint to then going on to Budrus? What was it that was keeping you focused on this region?
I think I remember actually this specific Q&A that we had in Seattle at a theater there for Encounterpoint when I realized how important the conversations that we were having regarding Counterpoint were for the communities that we were targeting with the film, and the transformation that we were seeing both individually and in different institutions that were opening their eyes to a different perspective that they hadn't been exposed to before. For those who don't know, Counterpoint came out in 2006. We were producing that film during the Second Intifada, and the images coming from the ground were overwhelmingly one portraying Palestinians as exclusively using violence as the way to reach their freedom and their independence and their very just causes of as an oppressed peoples. And it was very hard to get other stories out in American media at the time. And I saw the power of documentary storytelling in breaking through some of that stereotype and the impact we were having. And very soon, we learned about the story that was developing and had played out in this village of Budrus. And I became slowly very much connected to the communities, and we were increasingly being sought out as storytellers for this kind of stories that generally cannot get a lot of traction. And so Budrus became the next documentary film that we made at Just Vision. And once that film came out, I think it was really the moment that we saw the greatest level of distribution and engagement with our work. I think it really broke through and responded to a yearning in audiences internationally and in the United States for stories that were happening regularly. Budrus wasn't the only village that was using nonviolent resistance. Nonviolent resistance has been an integral part of Palestinian resistance movement through what Palestinians call popular resistance since the 1920s, since they were resisting British colonialism. And so the idea of the fact that so few of those stories had gotten out really reflected a very biased media environment, and one in which we felt we had a significant contribution to make. And that felt like a very useful way to use my skills as a filmmaker. And I increasingly became more and more connected to the team and to the issues on the ground.
So, Suhad, let me bring you into this because it was on Budrus that you started working with this team. Can you talk about your background before joining the team and what brought you into working on Budrus on its impact campaign?
For me, I really came to this work first as a community organizer. My family is Palestinian and Korean, and so the impact of war and conflict on communities and families was something that always lingered in the backdrop for me. It's no surprise that I became activated around following 9/11 in many ways. That is a time when I saw narrative be weaponized for the first time in a profound way, where all of a sudden family members, friends across the country were getting visits from the FBI, and over time, narratives that were built on stereotypes, built on assumptions, and not always built on accuracy, drove entire national policy that drove us to war. And so, as a community organizer, I got activated around the war in Iraq. I went on to do LGBTQ organizing in Philadelphia. And one of the things that I was really struck by, I moved to Israel and Palestine after university. What was supposed to be a short trip ended up being about a year of spending time on the ground with Palestinian and Israeli human rights defenders and activists who were all struggling for freedom and dignity and equality for all in the region. They reminded me of the people that I was organizing with back home. And I learned more in the first 2 weeks on the ground than I had in my entire life searching for these very stories. And I had access, right? I'm Palestinian, I'm Korean, and yet access to those stories were even difficult for me. And so when I came across Just Vision and I came across Budrus in particular, I thought it was extraordinary that a team would be using film and storytelling and narrative to create change in the conversation. It was the first time that I really saw an opportunity to wield what I saw as a very powerful tool and what I had experienced as a very negative tool, wielded against communities that I deeply cared about, to really shift hearts and minds. And so it was a really sweet invitation when I got to join this team, and I haven't looked back ever since.
So on Budrus, you were working on the outreach campaign. What did you experience when you were bringing this film to different audiences?
It was for me, it was a real mind-blowing experience. We had set out with Budrus to do two things. We wanted to put Palestinian-led popular resistance on the map and undermine the stereotype that Julia was speaking to earlier. We also wanted to equip activists and organizers with a tool that they could utilize in their own organizing, essentially using storytelling as fuel for movements. And we saw that happening across communities here in the United States and Israel-Palestine. I remember the first time that we screened Budrus in Budrus, and the whole community came out. And that was the first screening of the film. The use of the film in communities like Walaje, which has been resisting and organizing protests and popular resistance movements for years now, using Budrus as an organizing tool to help inspire and motivate continued protest movements there. Or Israeli activists who would screen Budrus on rooftops across cities to recruit other Israeli activists who would literally go to put their bodies and lives on the line to join in protests that were taking place in the West Bank. Or here in the United States, where Julia was speaking to Seattle. I mean, the number of screenings that we've had in the US with communities who have said, wait a second, I never knew of this story. How did I not know of this story? Was something that told me there was real opportunity, and that if we could keep going and keep bringing these stories to audiences in the US and beyond, Israel, Palestine, that there was something quite special in the documentary work we were doing.
So you've worked on the subject from different angles, producing a range of documentaries, but I want to ask about the most recent one that Julia, you directed, called Boycott. For people who haven't seen Boycott, can you summarize what it covers?
Boycott tells the story of three Americans from different political backgrounds who have challenged a US law that exists now in 37 states, saying that if you want a public contract, you need to sign a pledge promising not to boycott Israel for Palestinian human rights.
So this legal language was written as a kind of template that then was spread around to different states, and they would use the same language to write laws.
That's right. So when we started making the film Boycott, there were sort of two main reasons we felt the story was urgently needed. One, similarly to all of the other films we've made, we were shocked by how little public conversation and scrutiny these laws that had already, by the time we started production, passed in over 30 states had. The vast majority of Americans have no idea that this bill existed. And we felt that the bills were likely to be used as a template to attack organizing by other social justice movements. When we stopped, when we were locking picture on the film, those bills had started passing. So it was a theoretical threat during production, but it was one that we sadly, among many other observers, predicted was going to take place. And now it's been 3 years since the film has been launched, and we have seen a lot of these bills attacking the ability of Americans to boycott the fossil fuels industry if they're concerned about the environment, attacking the ability of Americans to boycott the firearms industry if they are concerned about gun safety for their kids in schools, attacking the ability of Americans boycotting for transgender rights, and the list goes on. It's really become one of the tools that conservatives and Republicans have been using across the country. Now, the reality is that when the original anti-boycott bill was passed targeting Palestinian human rights, it was a bipartisan bill. So Democrats overwhelmingly voted for this bill as well. A fact that we have now learned over the course of our impact campaign of the film, many of them deeply regret now that the consequences and also now that public scrutiny in large part due to the film has increased on them, we see Democrats now trying to backtrack on what really was something that they played an enormous role in opening this Pandora's box that now it's going to be very hard to close.
So in the film, which as you say you've completed a couple of years ago, but that tracks these three cases in Arkansas, Texas, and Arizona where people fought these state laws with the help of the ACLU. And in the original court cases that you document in the film, they all won those cases on First Amendment grounds at that stage. So the film, gave me some hope that like once these bills are actually tested against constitutional rights, that they don't hold up. But what's happened? Like, how do the cases that are in the film reflect what's going on today?
You're absolutely right that in the film, the three cases that we follow, by the end of the film, they are winning, the plaintiffs. Those wins have survived in 2 out of the 3 cases. So Bahia Maui in Texas and McJordal in Arizona won their cases, were able to go back to work and preserve their rights to engage in advocacy for Palestinian human rights. And that has had a significant impact on some of the ways in which the laws have been redrawn in other states, and also in a way that the new laws that have passed since then have been written, which is that the original way that these bills were written, it basically applied to anyone. And once Bahia and Mick won their cases, the laws were tweaked. So they're still unconstitutional, but they apply to a much smaller number of people because they only apply for contracts over $100,000 and for companies that have more than 10 employees. So the wins did have an impact on a large number of Americans, but the chilling effect remains because these bills still exist on the books, and the message that they send is that you're doing something illegal if you are participating in a boycott of Israel for Palestinian human rights. Also, and sadly, Alan Leverett, who was the third plaintiff, whose stories was profiled in the film. He is the publisher of the Arkansas Times out of Little Rock. His case was reheard by the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals by a request by the state of Arkansas. And in that rehearing, Alan lost his case. So this happened after the film had already been released. And the ACLU tried to get the Supreme Court to review the case, but the Supreme Court declined to review it, meaning that the Supreme Court at this stage has decided not to take on the constitutionality of anti-boycott laws. So they haven't ruled if those laws are constitutional or not. But because of that decision, all the states that fall under the jurisdiction of the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals do not have a right to boycott. Not only do not have a right to boycott Israel, do not have a right to boycott, period, because the constitutional question is not about Israel. The constitutional question is about whether we have a right to boycott or not in the US. And so it's a very precarious situation right now. Part of our impact campaign has been connecting with these other social justice movements that are now getting targeted by these bills, so that it's clear that this isn't a concern that affects only Americans who care about Palestinian rights, but that it affects Americans, period. And we have seen a lot of traction in that regard. So we are hopeful that as far as civil society goes, and as far as the Democratic Party goes, as I was mentioning earlier, we are seeing shifts. Sadly, of course, it's very scary to imagine what this Supreme Court will do once it takes the case on. So it's hard to know what you exactly hope for. But at the end of the day, the only way that the right to boycott will be ultimately preserved is if the Supreme Court reverses the decision by the Eighth Circuit.
So we're at a very confusing time where some courts have said this is unconstitutional to pass these laws to boycott. Another court has said, no, it's fine to do this. And I can appreciate that for most Americans, this seems like a very arcane thing that is not, on the front burner of the things that they worry about. I wonder if you can kind of flesh out, based on the experiences that you've had around this issue, why it is something that people should worry about.
Just to start and to say that that as the courts are deliberating, one of the things that's really important is that as we set out with our impact campaign for a boycott, is that we knew that this wouldn't be decided in the courts, not in the short term, and in the absence of courts that would be able to move quickly enough to put a stop to these bills. That there would need to be really deep grassroots organizing to raise awareness and continue to put pressure on political leaders who have clearly chosen to give away our rights for political interests. And so we're seeing some extraordinary movements emerge on a very local level in Virginia, where activists and organizers have been able to beat back the bill. Or as Julia mentioned earlier, in Minnesota, where we've been able to help introduce this story to environmental activists, to those who are concerned with housing, racial justice, and beyond, to build broader communities who are paying attention. But at the end of the day, when we think about why should we care about these bills, boycotts have always been a means in which we've been able to exercise collective political voice, where those on an individual level, where we may not be able to build power, that collectively we can choose to use our purchasing power in order to raise concern for the policies and practices of our government and of others. And that's been true of the US civil rights movements. We've seen that in Ireland, in the context of South Africa and beyond, to strip us of a tool that's become so critical to social change movements that have changed the course of history is deeply dangerous. But it's also coming in a very particular context where we're seeing an increase of authoritarian measures here in the United States that should concern us when we're thinking about how do we as Americans or as citizens of any country have the ability to exercise our voice in order to have greater democratic practice. This should be a concern for all of us, and really is a conversation around what is the power of our political voice and our ability to participate in a functioning democracy.
So that's the work of boycott that has been occupying you for a few years now. Can you talk to me about what happened with Just Vision's work after October 7th and the escalation of war in the region?
So, Just Vision has been for the last several years now, almost a decade actually. We've expanded our work into the field of journalism, where we have been producing investigative reporting and deep analysis so that we're able to provide accurate information and stories in real time as events are unfolding on the ground in Israel-Palestine. Since October 7th, our team has really pivoted the vast majority of our resources, human capacity, financial, and our focus and attention to getting the stories out of what's happening in Israel-Palestine. That included early on having our team at local call covering the voices of Israeli families who are bereaved or who have families who are hostages being held in Gaza, to being the only team that has journalists based out of Gaza who are reporting on the carnage of the Israeli assaults and war on Gaza over the last several months. And so we have been doing this through a number of means. First and foremost, by reporting those stories. We've actually broken a few investigations that have gone directly and taken on the Israeli government's kind of line that they've been concerned by for the civilian population in Gaza and turned it on its head. In fact, our investigative reporters have revealed that the Israeli government has chosen to increase the number of civilian casualties that they are okay with in terms of collateral damage, at times identifying military targets that result in the killing of hundreds of civilians for singular targets. And those stories have broken into the global conversation and really started to, in addition to the work of many activists and organizers, really raise into question the veracity of the Israeli government's claims at this time. And so that's been one way that we've been engaging. We've also been working on engaging journalists and teams at mainstream media outlets to help resource them with stories, to help ensure that they understand the implications of what's happening on the ground, and that they have correct information in a sea of misinformation. I mean, just to say, when we have political leaders, both in Israel-Palestine, but also in the United States, repeating misinformation and disinformation that adds to a lot of not only confusion, but at the end of the day informs entire policy. A lot of our work is about making sure that those journalists who are paying attention to this, who are trying to report on the story accurately, has the information that they need to do their jobs well.
Yeah, and I think the thing for me to add that was really personally very difficult and challenging, over the past 6 months, is that, when the horrific Hamas attacks happened on October 7, I think our entire team, like many observers, were very aware that unless we had strong leadership in the US and very serious journalism on the part of American journalists in that moment, we were about to witness a potential partial or complete destruction of the Palestinian population in Gaza. And our political leader and our media outlets failed us really badly in the moment that we needed them the most. And to see them make the same mistakes that were made, almost 20 years ago after the Iraq War, was really shocking. Tom, I mentioned to you that I started, my first documentary film was Control Room. It was about telling the stories about the Iraq War that the American media failed to tell Americans that were unfolding. It was about breaking through so many of the myths and the lies that perpetuated and have destroyed the lives of so many in the Middle East. And it was really shocking to see, the Biden administration and the State Department issuing orders that, words like de-escalation were prohibited from talking points, that like putting on red lines against Israel, that expressing, any sort of restraint on what Israel's response could be was out of the question. It was a total green light for Israel to respond however it wished. And Israeli society was in shock and completely traumatized, as they still are. And that has led the society, obviously there are notable and courageous exceptions to that, many of whom are our colleagues, but in its majority, we have seen a collapse of moral and ethical grounding on what they're willing to accept as a response to the horrific attacks that they experienced on October 7th. And so at Just Vision, we have been doing already this journalistic work before. Personally, my work has been focused on the documentary work, which is this longer term process where each film takes 2 to 3 years. But it became very clear in that moment that we needed to go into real-time narrative change. That there wasn't the time to produce a documentary film and talk about it in retrospect. We had colleagues in Gaza who were trying to stay alive. Several of them have now evacuated with their families. Some are still there. We have our Israeli colleagues who were also and still are in harm's ways, and while trying to tell the story and change the way in which Israeli society is understanding this moment, and the American landscape very similarly. One of the first things that we were trying to do was have Fadi Abu Shamala, our colleague in Gaza, write about what his experience was in the early days of the war. And he was the first Palestinian to be published in the New York Times after October 7. We know that several other pieces had been written and had been blocked. And Palestinians, there was a blackout of Palestinian voices in the American media. And the idea, the notion that after 20 years, we've learned no lessons at the time that when we need the most to hear from Palestinians, we perpetuate this idea that who is the good Palestinian who we can speak to, and once Fadi got published in the New York Times, then he finally got invited to speak on Meet the Press and on MSNBC and on CNN. And it was clear that it was this like, oh, the New York Times has now given the stamp of approval for this Palestinian. The racism was so flagrant and has been really shocking in the meetings that we've been having. And so that has been really hard. At the same time, the sort of the silver lining has been that as far as civil society goes, there has been huge shifts in the way that Americans see and understand the Middle East, and we've seen that in the way that there's been organizing against the war at a much faster rate, and with very strategic sort of trying to push the Biden administration to change its ways, and we've seen too slow but some beginning shifts on that, and so I think for us it's like it's really this moment of like we can't lose our moral compass, and Just Vision has been just going all in on helping us stay true to who we know we want to be in this moment.
Can you elaborate on the challenges, to say the least, of reporting in Gaza right now? I mean, the history of your work has always drawn a strength of being on the ground and being able to bear witness with your cameras. That's at a different level of difficulty than perhaps it's ever been. Can you share with what your experiences working with colleagues on the ground has been?
First, I think there's just a structural imbalance where no foreign journalists are allowed in Gaza. So the only people who are able to tell the stories of what's happening in Gaza are Palestinian journalists who are based there, or correspondents who were there before the war started. journalists have been targeted during the last several months at rates we have not seen historically in Israel-Palestine. Today, as of today, more than 90 Palestinian journalists have been killed, which, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, is the fastest rate of journalists being killed in any space around the globe in the last 3 decades. That is staggering. It's exactly when we need Palestinian journalists to be telling the story of what's happening in Gaza. What are the implications of Israeli policies on starvation, on the forced removal of communities in mass, in unprecedented levels of bombing and military incursions into civilian spaces. We actually are experiencing a level of kind of a blackout of information that really is not helpful to the common person to understanding what's happening, and certainly is meant to keep a kind of silencing of the Palestinian experience currently. And that's exactly why it's been so, for us, having team members, and I think this is part of Just Vision's model, recognizing that it is critical that the communities who are most deeply impacted by these policies are involved in telling those stories. It's also why it's incredibly meaningful that we have a team and journalists who are based in places like Gaza City and Khan Yunis, and ranging from Khan Yunis to Tel Aviv to Haifa to Ramallah to Jerusalem, grounded in the communities that they're a part of and that they are reporting on. It is deeply troubling that today we have 6 team members that have been based out of Gaza. Of those, we've already had to evacuate 4 and are struggling to evacuate the remainder. I think there is a big question around what this will look like for teams like Just Vision, but I think it's what we are seeing is that journalists are the lifeline that we need right now to getting the story right and to making ethical, moral decisions that will impact the lives of millions.
In any conversation about this topic, you're dealing with trauma on both sides. You're dealing with people, both Israelis and Palestinians, who live with an existential fear of their people being annihilated. And in that climate of fear, it's very hard to have a dialogue without quickly getting bogged down in an argument about language, about history, about misinformation. I think all of us in our daily lives feel very on guard, depending on who we're talking to, who we can have a dialogue with. What are the terms of that dialogue? Is it going to get anywhere, or is it just going to, cause more pain? I wonder what you've learned about holding those dialogues between people who come at the subject from different histories, different core feelings.
I think I speak for the entire team at Just Vision when I say that these have been the hardest times we've ever experienced, as far as trying to have conversations that can span the range of experiences right now. And in some ways, that's not surprising. I think the reality is that we're living through what might amount to a genocide in Gaza. The International Court of Justice is currently investigating on whether what Israel is committing in Gaza amounts to genocide. And the reality of that lived experience for Palestinians is one that comes at a moment where, I think for most of the world, I think there is an increased understanding and a sympathy with Palestinians and the Palestinian cause. I think we've seen that obviously at the UN Security Council and the numerous times that they tried to, pass a ceasefire resolution. And let's remember, those are ceasefire resolutions. All that those resolutions are saying is, let's stop the killing from both sides. Ceasefire is something that applies to both sides of the conflict. Let's stop killing each other. And the fact that that word for so many months, and I think for some people still is, so toxic and feels like an aggression to ask for the killing to stop, has made conversation really hard, really hard. And it is important for us to always speak and bring in as many people as possible to this work, right? I mean, at the end of the day, like, this is about, for us, this is about telling the stories that we're not seeing. So you want the people who don't know these stories to see it. That's the point. And so we don't want to just be speaking to the choir and to people who already agree with us. It is important to reach, as many diverse audiences as possible. It has also been really hard to see the world so differently than certain audiences at this moment. And our work has always been and continues to be grounded that, there's no dehumanization, right? Dehumanization of any side doesn't lead to any good. And so that continues to ground us, and that's how we speak in this moment, and that's how we approach, and with empathy, understanding that there is enormous trauma right now, particularly for Jewish Israelis, but also for Jewish communities around the globe. Again, the Jewish communities around the globe are diverse, and so some of the most active people protesting the war have also been Jewish. So this is not to paint any society and any community as having responded to this in a monolithic way. Communities are diverse and have responded to this in different ways, and I think for us is just how, and going back to what I said earlier, I really feel that we had a profound failure in political leadership and in the way that our media responded in that moment, right? The language that we've used, the way we described what happened in October 7, the way we described Palestinians, the words we used at the time, they were deeply dehumanizing, and they contributed to the trauma, I think, of certain communities, and to a narrative of existential dread among Jewish Israelis in particular. And Israeli media certainly has reproduced that narrative over and over again. And what we're trying to do is always hold people's, pain and grief and sorrow. Every human life is as valuable as the other. There's no difference between, a Brazilian child and a Palestinian child, an Israeli child and an American child. And that's what informs our work from a moral standpoint, and then from a journalistic standpoint, really wanting to ground us on the facts and on the reality, and trying to get people to come back to that reality, and to hold the horror that is unfolding in Gaza, and the urgent need that, if anyone who wants to see a future where both communities thrive in the region, that Israelis and Palestinians are there to stay, which is what has grounded Just Vision's work, who can't see that the most urgent thing to happen is for the killing to end. This is hard, right? Like, when you've been, working in many diverse communities for so long, and you see yourself trying to bring people to the place of just like, we have to stop the killing. But I think that this is the work, and this is what we have to do at this moment. And so we have continued to stay, true to who we are, and trying to get people to that place.
This is a time when it's easy to feel a lot of hopelessness. And I wonder what, gives you strength each day, and where are the areas that you find hope?
I often say that hope is a daily practice. It is waking up every day and recognizing that we have some extraordinary people that are doing this work. If you asked me 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago why I came to this work, I would have said because I thought the strategy that we were employing was so important to the world. And that's true today. I think it's really important. The thing that keeps me in this work are the incredible people who are doing this. I think we are living through a story of our times, a movement of our times, the millions of people who have taken to the streets to call for a ceasefire. The ways in which, as hard, as difficult, as um, infuriating at times this situation is, what is happening in Gaza is, as unjust as it is. We're also seeing people stand up that haven't stood up before. We were seeing a groundswell of folks who are sustaining movements. And we don't know if we're in a watershed moment, but we know that this is a defining time and that how we show up today actually matters. So without being Pollyanna, I wouldn't say that I wake up every day bursting at the seams with optimistic hope per se. But I do have a sense of fierce drive and a fierce belief in the people that we do this work with and the people who are showing up right now. And it's our work right now to keep making sure that folks know that there's a community of us, that they're not alone, that the biggest danger around silencing voices is about alienating folks so that you feel alone and small and invisible. And that's not what's happening. What's happening is that there's a groundswell and there are people out there, and we're going to keep going. We're going to keep telling the stories. And if anything, I believe in this team and the community that's doing this work. And I'm not just talking about Just Vision. There are countless teams out there and communities that are waking up every day to protest, every day to get another story out, every day to call a political leader, every day to make sure that someone in Gaza is being taken care of, evacuated, fed, and that there is coordination and collaboration and kindness in this work. And I believe that that's where the hope is, that's where the possibility is, and we're going to choose to keep pushing in that direction.
I want to thank the leaders of Just Vision for speaking with me. Suhad Babaa is Executive Director, and Julia Bacha is Creative Director. You can learn more about their work and watch their collection of films for free at justvision.org. Thanks to our team, series producer Hannah Nordenswan, newsletter manager Bella Racklin, and web designer Cross Strategy. Our theme music is composed by Andre Williams, and our executive producer is Raphael Nehausen. I'm Tom Powers. Follow us on Instagram and sign up for our newsletter at purenonfiction.net.